I want to talk now about the significance that this slave trade had to both Europe and to Africa. It's something that we, in this ahistorical society in which we live, a society in this world which cares so little for history, it's something that we don't often consider. But I think that you will see the tremendous impact that this slave trade had both on Europe, and apparently, I want to emphasize that word, an apparently very positive impact, and on Africa, a very overtly negative impact. So let's begin by looking at the significance of the slave trade for the Europeans. Again, what we're talking about here is the triangular trade. And it's important enough, I will repeat what the triangular trade is. It's important that you know this triangular trade. And we'll use as the European example Britain, because that's what I've been using in most of my examples. But I want to emphasize that we could substitute France or Spain or Holland or Portugal, all similar triangular trades. The essence of the triangular trade is this, is that there are goods loaded onto ships in, again, I'm using England, Britain as the example, loaded onto ships, which I'll get back to what that means. Those ships then go to the western coast of Africa. The goods that are loaded on those had been loaded on those ships are now offloaded, traded in Africa for human beings who are then put on the ship. Those human beings are transported across the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, to the Americas, oftentimes the Caribbean, Brazil, a small fraction of the total brought directly to the United States. And then from the Americas, the product of previous slaves, sugar, cotton, in Brazil, coffee and sugar, then brought back to England, and from England, those slave-produced commodities are sold in England and in Europe as a whole. The consequences for England, let's stay with England. But again, I want to emphasize, we can say this for all the European countries engaged in the slave trade, but we're going to stay with England. The consequences are explained with these economic terms: forward linkages and backward linkages. Forward economic linkages and backward economic linkages. And I want to begin with the backward economic linkages. This is the key to understanding European and American development, British economic development. A backward economic linkage is a linkage that you need. In order to carry out the slave trade, what do you need to carry out the slave trade? Well, you need ships. That's one thing. So the slave trade is an incentive to the British shipping industry. And a backward linkage is an economic factor that you need in order to do something else. The slave trade is tremendously profitable. And as a tremendously profitable trade, you need to do certain things. And these certain things, you've got to develop certain other sectors of your economy. Without the incentive to develop those other sectors of the economy, you may not ever develop those other sectors of the economy. And the other sectors of the economy that you need in order to carry out the slave trade involve things like building ships. So Britain in my lifetime, Britain was known as the greatest seafaring nation in the world. And that was built off of the slave trade. In order to carry out the slave trade, you needed to have ships, and many ships. And you needed an industry to produce those ships. And you needed an infrastructure to service those ships. An infrastructure, you needed ports. You needed warehouses. You needed the dock workers to work on those ships. You needed the sailors to sail on those ships. You needed the roads that connected those ports with the cities that were producing the goods that were sold, that were traded in Africa for the slaves. You needed to produce the goods that would be traded for the slaves. You needed banks to finance all this. You needed insurance companies to insure all this. These are the backward economic linkages that Britain must create in order to carry out the slave trade. And I want to emphasize again here that once you've got the ships, you don't necessarily have to carry slaves on them. But if you don't have the slaves, you won't build the ships. That's what this is talking about here. In fact, what we are talking about is that the slave trade, the backward linkages of the slave trade, are the very foundation of the British economic development of this time. Forward economic linkages. The forward economic linkages are those economic linkages that are made possible by the trade that you're engaging in. So by creating this slave trade, by selling slaves in the Caribbean, we now have a new industry, which is the sugar industry, and then later the cotton industry. The cotton textile industry, the first industry, the first mechanized industry in the world is the cotton industry. The cotton textile industry. Made possible by the product of slave labor. So both coming and going, the growth of the British economy to the point of becoming the preeminent economy in the world, the strongest economy in the world, most powerful nation in the world, from the 18th century into the beginning of the 20th century. That's Britain. And it is made possible by the slave trade. The slave trade is the foundation of British wealth. Oh, you say, oh, Professor Barber's saying that. No, Professor Barber isn't the only one who's saying that. Here are some contemporary English economists, British economists, and British politicians and spokesmen who are saying it. Contemporary. When I say contemporary, I mean people who lived at the time. This is Sir Dalby Thomas, governor of the British enclave at Cape Coast, Africa. The pleasure, the glory, and grandeur of England has been advanced more by sugar than any other commodity, wool not excepted. The thing that has built, he says, the thing that's built our economy more than anything, sugar. And sugar has its foundation in slavery and the slave trade. The slave trade, says William Wood, a British economist of that time, the slave trade is the spring, quote, is the spring and parent whence the other trades of the empire flow. The spring and parent, the slave trade, the spring and the parent from which these other trades flow. Or Malachi Postlethwaite, the leading British 18th century economist. This is what, I love that name, Malachi Postlethwaite. Here's what he says. He says, the slave trade is the first principle and foundation of all the rest, the mainspring of the machine which sets every wheel in motion. British trade is a magnificent superstructure of American commerce and naval power on an African foundation. When he says American, he's not talking about what we call the United States. He's talking about the colonies, the British colonies in the Americas. And the top of that colonial empire is not what becomes the United States, it's the Caribbean sugar plantations. The first principle and foundation of all the rest, the mainspring of the machine. You ever see one of those old-fashioned watches, you know, the kind that you used to wind up? There's a mainspring in that watch. And you wind up the mainspring, and the mainspring is what gets everything else going. The mainspring of the British economy, the slave trade, slavery. The British economy, the foundation of British wealth as the greatest wealth of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, the slave trade and slavery. Africa has built the British Empire. And I should say, as I've indicated, I'm using Britain as the principal example. But the same can be said for the United States and France and Belgium and Holland. In our next, we are going to talk about the consequences of the slave trade and slavery for Africa. Sumarera,